This lecture concludes the series on ancient Egypt by turning to the later New Kingdom and what followed the re-establishment of polytheism and the old pantheon in Egypt after the death of Akhenaten. Akhenaten, who reigned briefly from 1353 to 1335 BCE, is going to die suddenly, and we'll find that his statues and temples are immediately destroyed, and the capital of Egypt moved back to Thebes away from Amarna. Now, this is going to lead to 2 years of unrest without an heir, for we did not have a son by Nefertiti, his principal queen and wife.
This strategy of trying to return the religion and the capital to their previous glories is going to require a puppet pharaoh for a short time. And we find that after Akhenaten died, he did not have a very clear rightful heir, for Nefertiti did not give birth to a son. So we find that Tutankhamun, one of the most famous pharaohs in all of history because of an accident that we will discuss momentarily, becomes pharaoh, most likely being Akhenaten's son by a minor wife. Therefore, he legitimately could rule because we find pharaohs have many wives just in case they do not have a son with their primary wife as a backup. But we also know that he was too young when his father died to take over. And so, as with Chetsep, we often find regents will be assigned to them. Now, Tutankhamun rules for a very short time and then dies at 18 years of age, usually the period in which pharaohs can take over and rule themselves. Now, Tutankhamun, or King Tut, is arguably the most widely known and famous pharaoh that most people can name. However, he is not significant in really any way, for the important things he actually accomplished are as follows. He is going to die, and he manages not to have his tomb looted by robbers and or grave robbers here. So here we have Howard Carter discovering the tomb in 1922, intact. And what we find with the tomb is that his death was relatively unexpected and sudden. And so they had to rush, to hurry, to prepare everything for the pharaoh's afterlife, including even his mummy. Now, the tomb of King Tut, or Tutankhamun, again connecting him to the new god, changing his name to reflect Amun for Amun-Ra as opposed to Akhenaten, for instance. Here we have the 3 primary chambers along with an annex, where we have the burial chamber with several coffins within coffins. Then we have the treasury, as it is nicknamed, with various implements such as boats and once again a litter to carry the pharaoh in processions. In the antechamber and annex, we have soldiers to protect him. We have chairs for him to sit on. We have wheels as backups for chariots and various other sundries. In the innermost chamber, where we find his burial chamber to be, we have the pharaoh painted on the wall being greeted by the other gods in the next life, as one does when they transfer or transition over to the next life.
The decorations surrounding his tomb include paintings of baboon gods, Baba specifically, who serves the god Thoth, who writes one's name down in the Book of Life. Here we find they are shown directing scribes and watching the scales in the underworld, symbols of wisdom. Along with Baba, we have the traditional pantheon returning, such as Hathor, Anubis, Osiris, all in traditional scenes with the traditional canon, showing the deceased presented in the underworld. This surrounds the massive outermost section of King Tut's coffin that opens here by way of 2 doors to innermost coffins that nest within one another like Russian nesting dolls.
To illustrate how extravagant and how sumptuous other Egyptian tombs must have been. Here we have a pharaoh who died unexpectedly at 18 years of age, whereas we have others like Ramses II ruling for 67 years. And even here in King Tut's tomb, we manage to find that the coffin is itself just one of these coffins, a quarter ton of gold. So the amount of riches in this relatively unknown and insignificant pharaoh's tomb is staggering. Now here we have, as is common to protect the pharaoh, a series of coffins and then innermost coffins as well protecting the mummy. On it we have the pharaoh himself shown in the guise of Osiris, the god of the underworld, with his arms crossed across his chest, his legs together as though he is a mummy. Under his hands, we see two vultures for the vulture goddess Nekhbet, that being showing that he rules not only Upper but Lower Egypt, with the uraeus cobra of kingship now on his head next to a vulture. So this is the final addition you can see to the left here of the Egyptian pharaonic headgear. So now we still retain the Nimi's headdress, this linen head wrap that goes around the pharaoh's head. Also practical because it protects you against sunburns. But on it now, the pharaoh looks like the hooded cobra that he is intended to imitate and to have the power of. But on his brow, now decorated in lapis lazuli and semi-precious stones, we have an actual cobra, and then next to it, the vulture. So again, this goes back to the very beginning in pre-dynastic Egypt of the gods and goddesses worshipped in different regions, from the vulture goddess to the cobra goddess. He still wears, inlaid with lapis lazuli, a false beard. So we find that the death mask, which is the innermost mask that was pressed against the mummy's face and the linen wraps, is going to imitate and continue in a more detailed tradition and fashion what we see here to the right in the innermost coffin, which is just outside of it. So much like Russian nesting dolls, we have these figures within figures within figures, all to protect the pharaoh, to ensure that his ka was not destroyed and that his body remains intact to transition to the afterlife. Because his body was found intact and undisturbed, we can actually reconstruct what the pharaoh looked like thanks to CT scans. And we know that he did not have the same type of deformity as is represented in the Amarna period style. We can reconstruct roughly what he looks like here. Now, if you compare it to the images of the pharaoh in his effigy on his death mask, we note that they are not that different. And so there would have been a common line and or family bloodline that would have been carried through in these dynasties. So they would have looked similar to, but still an idealized version of, actual people. Now, we do know that they were in an incredible rush to complete the mummification process, for they put the mummy inside of the coffin with the death mask over his face on the wet linen wraps. They had not yet dried, and so his face literally glued to the inside of the mask, and it was broken when they tried to remove it initially in the 1920s.
The burial chamber was, of course, only one of many sections of King Tut's tomb, and, of course, is only one of the artifacts that is found within. We find that through several antechambers we have storage rooms that contain a variety of objects, from chairs to thrones to carved soldiers to those to serve the king and the underworld. The thousands of objects were carefully catalogued first by Howard Carter, which then would go on to travel the world, reigniting an interest and spark in ancient Egypt and Egyptology between the world wars. The items shown can be seen in other funerary arts, such as a statuette of Tutankhamun on a papyrus boat as a harpooner, reenacting the same ceremony of hippopotamus hunt talked about earlier with T in his hippopotamus hunt from around 2450 BCE. Here we find that the activities once reserved only for lowly commoners and servants, now practiced by the very king of the underworld now himself.
Now, in addition to the pharaoh's mummy and a massive gold coffin and series of inner coffins, we also have a whole plethora of objects that the pharaoh needed for the afterlife. And as a convention, even though this pharaoh was too young to go to war, you are not allowed in war as a man until you become a man at 18 years of age.
Interestingly, the composition is actually retained from the Amarna period and the father of King Tut. Here we find a drawing of a scene in an Amarna tomb whereby Akhenaten himself rides this chariot over his enemies with, again, soldiers surrounding him. In the version of Akhenaten, however, his visage is destroyed, ensuring that he cannot come back in the next life.
Regardless, he is still going to be shown in this tradition as a great warrior, firing arrows from a chariot pulled by two horses, trampling enemies in front of him. So this is going to not be factual. It's not recording what he actually did, but instead it shows what kings and pharaohs need to be. They must be presented as a warrior and a conqueror, even if they did not do that. Now, turning to the other objects in the tomb here, we can see that it is impossible to completely divest oneself of a style overnight. So the same artists that are working for Akhenaten, creating the works for the Amarna style, then are making the works for Tutankhamun here, Akhenaten's son. So we still see, such as with the lion throne here, which is the same going back to the seated statue of Khafre. Pharaohs are associated with lions and royalty, and so we have lion heads and paws on the ends and the feet of this chair. But if we look carefully at how Tutankhamun is shown, along with the goddess Hathor here, the divine mother of the pharaoh, seen by her horned headdress, we see that the same proportions and design is going to be carried out and continued here, as Akhenaten and Tutankhamun are both shown in the same slouching position, the protruding abdomen and flowing hips being present, and organizing the figures around a gracefully curving contour.
In the end, however, we do not know how King Tut actually died. There are a number of theories, of course, that include being killed in a chariot crash, kicked to death by a horse, attacked by a hippo, like the very first king of Egypt, King Menes. He could have had a broken leg in an infection that ensued, or he simply could have died of inbreeding, and finally, the most ominous and the most conspiracy theory-ridden of them all, murder. What we do know of his corpse is that he had a broken leg, his back ribs were broken along with his chest. The mummy was also in bad condition, charred and burned. So was this the result of an accident, or once again was his body intentionally destroyed?
Now, accompanying Tutankhamun in his tomb would have been a Book of the Dead, which many mummies are found with if they're found intact at all. Now, a Book of the Dead is a scroll that accompanies mummies with, again, protective spells in them describing what will happen in the afterlife and what to do at each stage. Now, in these collections of spells and prayers, often placed on and between the knees of the deceased, we are going to find that they are seen as quite essential handbooks and guides, so that we know what to expect. What chants do we need? What spells do we need to recant here and or spell out in order to protect ourselves from being eaten in the underworld? Well, here is a standard example of what happens in the afterlife. We often see it painted on the coffins of mummies as well in the Last Judgment of Hunefer. So preceding Christianity by over a millennium, we're going to have a scene of judgment and the weighing of souls that will be the basis for the Christian understanding of what happens at the end of time. Here we have Hunefer, who is identified as the royal scribe and steward of Seti I. Thus, of course, he is buried in the Theban necropolis, or the city of the dead next to Thebes.
Books of the dead can be found throughout ancient Egypt and were for the scribes all the way up to the pharaohs themselves. Thus, here we have a pharaonic version of what happens in the afterlife, as the pharaoh must then attend to fighting the serpent that would eat the sun, passing through these various doors and gates, whereas more common people, like scribes, viziers, and so forth, would have the one that we're discussing now.
We begin at the far left in the upper portion, seeing Hu-Nefer kneeling before the pantheon, showing us that he is pious and that he has given gifts and prayers to all of the gods, so that they will look upon him favorably. That is not enough, though, to pass into the afterlife. Below, you often find Hu-Nefer is going to be led, dressed in white, as is all of the figures that are going to be shown in these last judgments. He's led by the left hand by Anubis, the god of mummification with a jackal's head. So remember that he's going to bind the body of Osiris, making him the first mummy. Therefore, you pray to Anubis in order to have a successful mummification process. He holds an ankh in his left hand, showing us that he is leading us to everlasting life in ancient Egypt. Now, Anubis then takes the soul, or ka, of Hu-Nefer and places it on the left scale, whereas on the right scale we have a feather of the god of judgment and or fairness, Mat. So we find that his heart must be lighter than a feather. And we can see here that, in fact, it is higher than the feather. And so he is able to avoid the horrific ordeal that would have taken place if he were found wanting, and that's Ammit. Ammit is going to be the most ferocious beast Egyptians can imagine. It was a combination of a hippo in his back section, a lion for his torso and front legs, and then a crocodile for a head. So he is the one who will eat your soul, thus blinking you out of existence, destroying you entirely if you are not pure. Because Hu-Nefer is pure, we find that Thoth, the ibis-headed god, and the one who records your name in the book of life, and is also the messenger to the gods, is writing his name down. He has passed. So we see him again now to the right, dressed in white, being led by Horus, the falcon-headed god, who the pharaoh is the incarnation of in this world, holding an ankh with his left hand again, directing him to the next phase. The next phase is going to find the son of Osiris, Horus here, directing and presenting this person who has passed the test to enter into the underworld with Osiris, the god of the underworld, with his sisters Isis and Nephthys behind him. So we find that he's seated like a king. He is going to have his arms across his chest, holding the shepherd's crook and riding crop. These elements which relate him to shepherding a flock, which will also be important for Christianity when we get to it. Now, the conventional proportions of the figures here are going to be consistent with those from the pre-dynastic period. So we're returning to conservatism. We're returning to the proportions that have been used for millennia. And they are able to do so because of the way in which Egyptians are trained and how they draw figures on walls and on papyrus with a grid-like system.
With the death of King Tut, generals Horemheb and Ramses I, who would found the 19th dynasty, took control. They erased Akhenaten and Hatshepsut from the record and backdated their own rule, destroying their temples. Seti I, who was the son of Ramses I, inherited a weak kingdom, but built the Great Hall at Karnak. Here we find that a successive number of pharaohs from the 18th and 19th dynasties will continue to build and add to this huge complex dedicated to worshiping not just Amun-Ra, but all gods in the Egyptian pantheon, or all the gods in ancient Egypt. Now here we have the temple built around an artificial lake, which stands in for those primeval waters at the beginning of time, out of which a sacred temple or bin is going to rise. Hence the temple here is meant to reference that mound on which Amun-Ra will appear from these dark primordial waters, drying them up as the sun. Here, this artificial lake still survives to this day, as do much of the temple complex aspects itself, from the pylon walls to the hypostyle hall. Leading up to the temple, as with Hatshepsut's tomb and temple out front, we have a series of sphinxes. So here we have the avenue of the sphinxes leading up into the walls that are meant to intimidate us as guardian figures. For the walls shut off the sight, and Amun-Ra himself guards the temple. An interesting development happens here at Karnak in this period, for it is now that Amun-Ra is shown with a ram's head, both in the sphinxes that line the entryway to the temple and in sunken relief on the sides. It would be the 18th dynasty pharaohs who, from Thebes, are going to adopt a local deity who was the most important, Amun-Ra. The Karnak temple was dedicated to him after the expulsion of the Hyksos, or shepherd kings, these foreign invaders from the north like the Hittites. It was at this time that they conquered the Kush kingdom in the Sudan. The Kush had a ram deity related to Amun, so the Egyptians took the curved woolly ram's horns and added them to their own god Amun-Ra. Thus, lining the entryway to the temple of Amun-Ra, we have sphinxes, but now these guardian figures are going to have a lion's body and the head of a ram with a curled horn. This is going to serve the same function and even has the same horns that are going to be twisting as a lamassu of the earlier periods that we discussed, such as the Assyrians. In fact, the motif would later be adopted in representations of Alexander the Great. After he was proclaimed a god by Egyptian priests at Karnak, he would then show himself on coins with the same curled horn, showing that he is the sun god incarnate. Now, only pharaohs and priests could enter the sanctuary through the hypostyle hall, and these reliefs are going to cover the facade of the pylon walls, which are slanted walls on the exterior, again in sunken relief, communicating the greatness of Ramses II and other pharaohs that patronized this site. They are going to be shown generally coming to the gods, holding the symbols or the Ankh, the symbol of eternal life. Thus, through the commissioning and patronizing of these gods, the pharaohs cement their place in the afterlife. Now, one of the greatest inventions of the Egyptians is going to be an architectural addition to structures that up until now had been only post and lintel, thus could not let in light to dark, nebulous interior spaces. So here, in a reconstruction of the hypostyle hall, we continue those freestanding columns, massive, massive forests of them here, and a new invention. So in the hypostyle hall, which is a row of columns supporting a roof, which is what a hypostyle hall is, literally a hall of columns, we have each one of them decorated with sunken relief sculpture, with deeply inset and cut outlines, so we can read them very graphically. Even easier at the time, they would have been polychromed or painted in encaustic, making them even easier to understand. Now, the columns are massive, at 66 feet tall, supporting this lintel above them. Now, they are 22 feet in diameter. It takes nearly 10 men just to encircle hands around them. Now, they are put together not with the help of cement, but are cut as solid stone blocks in cylinders that lay one on top of the other. The forms, we will note, are going to be of the natural flora in ancient Egypt, in this case, a papyrus blossom. Now here we have another image showing you these blossoms that are growing from the floor and that would have been very intimidating and dominating this interior space. Now, the interior space would also have been illuminated thanks to the new invention of a clear story. Now, the clear story is going to be an additional story above the standard level of columns below. Thus, we have slats that let in light and ventilation to the interior space, which would otherwise only be illuminated by way of, say, gas lamps and or torches. Now, this is going to be a technique that's adopted and used by Christians in their early designs as well. Please take the time now to watch Seti I and Engineering an Empire, and be sure to do so at least after watching this video to see exactly how the Egyptians built the Temple of Karnak and the hypostyle hall. Turning to Ramses II, the son of Seti I, we have the last great warrior pharaoh. Now, he is the pharaoh mentioned in Exodus by the Hebrews, who had a 67-year building program and rule, where he made various temples and complexes around ancient Egypt. Pushing back foreign invaders, he would reclaim northern territory from the Hittites, expanding Egyptian rule back up to the north and the delta. At the temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, we have the tradition in the New Kingdom carried on, where we have the most visible and prominent elements on the exterior, not relating to the tomb, but instead the temple out front. Now, this is going to be the site of an engineering marvel in 1968, when this temple was moved 700 feet to avoid submersion in the Aswan High Dam. It was then, with a coalition of American, Egyptian, and European archaeologists and engineers, taken apart piece by piece and reassembled, this entire mountain reassembled, 700 feet away. In reassembling these massive colossi, which there are 4 of, with the face of Ramses II on each one, we find that at 12 times the size of an ancient Egyptian that we are sacrificing detail for scale here, as he is shown seated rigidly at a right angle with his arms on his knees as he stares out, wearing the false beard, the uraeus cobra of kingship, and the Nemes headdress, clearly being identified as a pharaoh and as Horus incarnate in this world. Elsewhere on the exterior of the temple, we have the pharaoh shown as a conqueror, as he brings back and subjugates all of these various slaves from the Hittite Empire in sunken relief. Now, unlike regular low relief, sunken relief actually cuts into, in a negative fashion, the dark outlines and contours of these figures. Thus, it's going to be inset behind the surface of the stone wall instead of projecting from it in other examples. This gives a very clear, graphic, and visible way in which to communicate at a distance given the shadows and contours that are created. Now, just like other temples, we find the exterior has 4 effigies of the pharaoh, massive statues dedicated to him, while on the interior we move into the underworld, where the actual inner sanctuary and crypt would be. Now, as in New Kingdom examples like Senmut's funerary temple of Hatshepsut, we find that the tombs, which earlier would have been the most prominent, are now hidden inside of the mountains themselves. We must enter inside, and of course only pharaohs and high priests are allowed to do so, in order to find the final statues and burial places. As we enter into the mountainside, we find carved out of the living rock itself, we have entering into the crypt, as though we are entering into the underworld, walking beside and in between these massive statues. The statues are going to show the pharaoh Ramses II in the guise of Osiris, the god of the underworld. Now, he is shown as a statue or column, and when they are male, these are known as Atlantids, or as the Greeks will call them, Herms. Now, we find that the pharaoh is shown as Osiris with his arms rigidly bound to his body in an X shape, carrying a riding crop and a whip, and then he's going to be in the pose of the first mummy, because Osiris was the first mummy to enter the underworld, thus he rules over it. Please take the time after this lecture to watch Ramses II and Engineering an Empire following this video directly below it, to learn more about how these massive monuments were created by Egyptian builders. And so, with the last great warrior pharaoh, we find a decline in the last millennium BCE when Egyptian is conquered by several foreign invaders. The 20th dynasty, in fact, all took the name Ramses as a show of power and force, yet we see this is merely going to be a ruse to distract from the decay in power. Tax revenues fell sharply as temples took land at the expense of the state. But of course, given that land is a primary source of income because you can grow crops on it and tax it, the more that's given away or taken by the temples, the less that the state has, thus the less revenue it has. Now, the pharaohs were also elderly when they took the throne, so the average reign of a pharaoh in this last section and period of Egyptian rule was under 12 years. Thus, we did not have sustained political cohesion. Finally, the gold mines in Nubia were exhausted. Thus, the Egyptians were running out of money. We see the societal collapse manifested in tomb and temple robberies, where mummies are gathered together in the Valley of the Kings and burned for fire, and or all of their goods ransacked. The people, of course, that are robbing and looting the tombs were the very descendants of those who had buried them, so they knew where they were. Still, the traditional canon was kept. As an example, here we have the mayor of Thebes, who was the 4th priest of Amun in the 26th dynasty, Mentuamet. Mentuamet is going to be shown, as is the rest of Egyptian freestanding sculpture, in the traditional pose of rigidly upright, fists and arms to the side of the body, left foot forward, right foot back, with a stylized headdress being worn by the figure, a trifold kilt, and then a naturalism seen in him as well.
And the same proportions as we looked at before established in the Old Kingdom with examples like Menkaure. Here we find that he is imitating the image of power because he is an administrator. He is powerful himself, but he's outside of the royal family and is not divine. So his face is shown as middle-aged and or as imperfect. There are lines, we have crow's feet, we have a very definitive nasolabial fold with creases across his cheeks. And he wears not a Nimmy's headdress, but instead the woven headscarf that imitates that image of power.
The Persian Empire would conquer Egypt in 525 BCE. From this point onward, Egypt would no longer be ruled by native Egyptians. It would be then in 330 BCE that Alexander the Great conquered it, making it part of the vast Hellenistic Empire, and it was broken up into the Ptolemaic dynasty, those ruled by the Greek Ptolemies. The pylon temple design, as we saw at Karnak, was retained in ancient Egypt well into the Roman period, after we find it is going to be bequeathed to Octavian. Here is where we find an interesting combination of different traditions and religions, where the Greeks combined deities with those of ancient Egypt, such as the head of the gods on Mount Olympus, Zeus, would be combined with Ra, on the left-hand side seen here, or Hades would be combined with Osiris, the two gods associated with the underworld, now known as Serapis. The Greeks also kept the Egyptian canon and religious traditions alive. So the artists and artisans who had been practicing this for millennia and generations, passing it down father to son, still had their work reproduced and patronized under the Greeks and then the Romans. This we can see even in books of the dead that were produced for Romans and Greeks well into the Ptolemaic period. Late Egyptian art is also a hybrid of these cultures. Here we have Roman and Egyptian conventions at the end here from 715 to 332 BCE, coming together in the traditions of mummification and of the Roman penchant for careful portraits. Painted in encaustic, we have a mummy wrapping of a young boy, whereas the Egyptians would mummify their dead and wrap them very carefully into these mummies and put them inside of a plaster inner coffin and then place that inside of an outermost coffin. The Romans would make wax death masks and have portraits painted of their loved ones. So these two traditions interestingly coalesce in this hybridity seen in late antiquity. Here we have a very naturalistic portrait of a young boy who has died. Thus we find the two traditions, one of a carefully rendered portrait and the other of preserving the body brought together. Next class, we will turn from ancient Egypt to the prehistoric Aegean and slowly see these ideas impacting a culture that overlapped it from the Great Pyramids of Giza to King Tut.